I am Lore Seeker, and we are continuing Children of the Nameless by Brandon Sanderson. This might be the final part. I think we only have 3 or 4 chapters to go, so I'm going to try and get through it all in one shot. And with that being said, let's continue with Chapter 17, Unison. Willia. Willia was alive. Takenda tried to rush into the room to embrace her sister, but Davriel seized her by the shoulder, his grip strong and firm, and something was wrong with Willia. The way she glowed, the power Takenda felt emanating from her. She wasn't a geist. She was the one controlling them. Willia, Takenda pled. What have you done? Willia stood up, wearing her white burial dress. They put me down here, you know. Guarding the stone is one of the duties they give to the new acolytes. I made them give me duty during the days because I didn't want to be down in this place of death when the pure darkness took me. You know that darkness, don't you, Takenda? Willia stared into the stone's shifting light. It spoke to me, she whispered, told me of power that I held, that we held. Power to stop the darkness. I just had to make it whole, find the other pieces scattered through the people of the approaches, each one with a little sliver. That sweet voice was so familiar, and yet the edge to it, the rawness, was so terribly wrong. Willia, Takenda whispered, what did you do to our parents? Willia finally looked up at her, and she could see. It was night, but she could see. For the first time in her life, Takenda looked into her sister's eyes, and Willia looked back. I didn't mean to take them, Takenda, Willia said. They were carrying offerings to the bog, what I thought was a false god. I yelled and argued, but I didn't mean to kill them. But the power I'd taken from the stone, it combined with my power and cried out for more. In the end, I let it loose on them and it just happened. You killed them. Not killed. Reclaimed. Willia stepped forward, the sealing stone's shifting colors reflected in her eyes. At first, I thought the voice in the sealing stone was her, you know. The angel? I thought she was the one whispering to me. I didn't know then that she was already dead. Crunchnar slipped carefully into the room. Davriel kept hold of Takenda, blocking the way out of the small chamber, Miss Highwater standing just behind him. Takenda's worry spiked as she noted Crunchnar easing his sword from its sheath. No, Takenda said. Stop, Willia. Lord Cain can restore the souls to their bodies if you release them. It's going to be all right. We can fix this. You assume I want to. Willia eyed Crunchnar, then tipped the sealing stone off its pedestal, sending it to the ground, where it smashed apart. I don't have to hide from the darkness anymore, Takenda. I don't have to cower behind your song. She raised her hands, and a deep, powerful glow began to rise within her. It is time that the darkness feared me. Davriel had heard enough. He struck, piercing the young woman's mind, digging for her talent. Perhaps she was new enough to her powers that he could reach inside, pluck the entity she held, and Davriel slammed into something, an impossible force, even more vast than he found in Takenda. Willia rebuffed Davriel with an almost indifferent stroke. He was forced back into his own mind with a grunt, a terrible headache stabbing him right behind his eyes. And then Willia released a column of green-white energy, so bright it painted the walls of the room iridescent. No. Davriel summoned the remnants of the power he'd taken from Takenda, the protection ward. Pain split his head as he used it, raising the power like a shield. The glowing green barrier he created blocked Willia's incredible bolt of light, forming a bubble of safety in which Davriel sheltered the surprised Miss Highwater. Crunchnar, however, was vaporized in the blink of an eye. The demon's sword, which he'd been raising to strike at Willia, clanged to the floor. Takenda screamed and fell to her knees, but this power was like a condensed, raw version of her warding zone. It wouldn't harm a human like her. Bits of ash from Crunchnar's corpse blew around Davriel, who grunted, holding his protective ward firm. The warding light beat against his shield like a physical force, spraying around him like a river, filling the corridor behind him. Only the little space just behind him was safe from it. "Hellfire," Miss Highwater said, pulling against him as her fingers touched the flow of light and was burned. "Dav?" "I believe," he said with effort, "I may have misjudged our opponent's strength." He stumbled beneath the force of the warding light. His shield was made of the same power, but was far, far weaker. "Here we are at last," the entity said in his mind, sounding satisfied. "The fight, as I promised you. Here we prove ourselves and claim a second strength as our own." Davriel grunted, sweat streaming down the sides of his face as he squeezed every ounce of strength from the shielding ward. It wasn't going to be enough. He could see that easily. "Use me," the entity said. "Use me now, as you did once before." "No," Davriel thought. "Why? Why do you resist? This is your moment. Seize it." Davriel turned, with effort, to regard Miss Highwater. She huddled close to him as his magical shield frayed. The two of them stood in the doorway into the room, the corridor behind them completely flooded with light. There was nowhere for her to run. If he let the shield fall, she'd be vaporized. "I still have the dismissal spell," he whispered to her. "A little of it. It should work on you as a creature of magic." She looked at his green shield of force, which was crumbling at the edges. "You should reform like the Geists," Davriel said. "The dismissal was a temporary effect for them." He looked into her deep red eyes, sweat dripping down his face. "It's all I have." She nodded. "Do it." He prepared the spell, the power gathering. The room tinted blue as his eyes flooded with it. Miss Highwater grabbed his shirt just beneath the collar, then pulled her face up close to his. "Don't you die, Davriel Keen," she whispered. "I'm not done with you yet." He smiled, then grunted again beneath the force. "Remember, I wanted to stay inside for the evening." He used the dismissal spell. A piece of him cracked as her gray skin melted away to black smoke, her ledger dropping to the ground as she vanished. Davriel screamed as his ward shattered, then light washed over him. It blinded him, tugged faintly at his soul like a child pulling on his cloak, but it didn't harm him. He was, even still, human. The light finally faded, but left him blind. Davriel stumbled to his feet, turning, blinking and trying to recover his vision. Seeing only white, he activated his weapon summoning spell to at least have a sword. The object that formed in his hand, however, was of an awkward wooden shape. That blasted viol again. Hellfire. Why did the magic consider it a weapon? Willia didn't attack him in his moment of weakness, though he heard her whispering. Orders? Distant whispers sounded in the catacomb halls, echoing her voice. She was bringing those geists down for him. As proven with the priests, they could claim the souls of outsiders as easily as they did approachers. With the entity powering such abilities, how long would it be before this entire plane was occupied with nothing more than terrible green spirits whispering to one another? "You will never defeat another entity on your own," the entity said inside his mind. "She will destroy you, unless you destroy her first and take the power for yourself." A hand grasped Davriel's. "This way," Takenda said. In the moment, he'd almost forgotten her. The young woman towed him away from the room and, still blinded by the light, he turned and fled with her. Chapter 18. Unison. Morning arrived as Takenda led Davriel away from the room, and with the coming sun, her sight, already fuzzy from the flash that Willia had released, slipped away. The second darkness descended, and she found herself moving down the hallway by touch, pulling Davriel after her. Willia's footsteps followed. "I should have been strong enough to kill you myself," the girl said, her voice echoing against the catacomb walls. "I didn't have trouble stabbing the priest, so my spirits could enter the church. Afterward, I stood behind you in the village, knife in hand, and I heard you begin singing. I have always loved that song, Takenda." Takenda pulled herself along, feeling with one hand at the wall's crypts, leading Davriel with the other. Smooth, polished stone, cold beneath her fingers, tomb after tomb. "Willia," she said, "this is insane. You're not like this." "What am I like, Takenda? Am I the confident girl that everyone saw? Or am I the terrified one you saw, the one who knew that every night the darkness would come for her again?" "No, Willia," Takenda said, reaching an intersection in the catacombs. The stairs were to the left, but whispers came from that direction. She turned in the darkness, toward Willia's voice. "Please. This is what we were always meant to be, Takenda," Willia said. "We two are one soul, and our power, it was always only a part of what it could have been. I needed the souls of the others to put back together the pieces of the entity. I didn't feel bad for doing that. It was inevitable. The entity's destiny was to become whole again." "And the priests?" Takenda demanded. "What is your excuse for killing them?" Silence, other than Davriel pulling up beside her, then cursing under his breath. He seemed to be getting his sight back. At least, he started toward the stairs, but then stopped, as if he's seen the geists in that direction. "I won't be weak again, Takenda," Willia said. "Each bit I claim gives me more light. Right now, I'm blind for only a few hours around midnight. If I put the entity back together, I'll be whole. I'll never have to be trapped in that terrible, unbearable darkness again." That harshness seemed so strange to hear in her sister's voice. "Come," Davriel said, pulling her by her hand away from the approaching whisperers. Takenda resisted. Surely she could make Willia see. Surely... "I know that tone of voice," Davriel said. "She's listened to the entity's promises for long enough to start believing them. Come." Takenda relented, letting him pull her down a side corridor of the catacombs. It was hopeless. The Whisperers would flood the area. Soon she and Davriel would join that terrible, whispering throng. Still, she followed in darkness, and as she did, she thought she heard something over the whispers, a song that seemed at once distant and close, something she knew, somehow, that she could only hear while within the second darkness. Distant because of its ephemeral, out-of-reach softness. Close because it pierced through all other sounds and made something stir within her. What was that song? Davriel hastened down the corridor, pulling Tekenda with him. His eyesight had recovered, but Tekenda's curse had obviously taken her. Fool man, he thought at himself, you should have seen this outcome. He'd recognized that Tekenda's power should have let her influence the Geists, but he hadn't put together that the supposedly dead twin would be in an even better position to do so. Perhaps it had begun as innocently as she insisted, killing her parents by accident. Then she'd needed a scapegoat for her murders, and who better than the man of the manor? She could have stopped at that, and likely no one would have ever known. But the entity whispered that she needed more, and so the attack on the merchants, witnessed by a priest. Had she arranged for him to be there, to corroborate her story that Davriel was the culprit? In any case, he should have seen. Someone had stitched a costume to imitate him, and he hadn't wondered if it might be the daughter of the village tailors. Davriel, Tekenda hissed as he pulled her down another corridor. Look for murals on the walls. Rom said that some of them lead to hidden exits out of the catacombs. There was one in the room with the sealant stone. He pulled up short as green light lit the other end of the corridor. Hellfire. They were this direction too? He turned, pulling Tekenda down a side hallway. Use me, the entity said. It is beyond time. He ignored the entity, instead searching through his resources. He didn't have much left. The pyromancy was gone, as was the dismissal spell. The weapon summoning spell lingered, but would be useless, as would the silly spell for making ink appear on a page. Otherwise, the remnant of the prioress's power was the only thing he had left. Well, that and his last resort, his ability to leave a plane and walk the blind eternities to another realm. He could take nothing with him, however, and in doing so would abandon everything he'd built here. You would run as a coward? The entity asked. Before using me. Why? He risked a glance over his shoulders. Sickly green geists flowed in and out of the walls, moving toward him. The young woman, Tekenda's sister, stood at the far back of their ranks, just a shadow. Right. His only chance was to find a way out of this maze and flee to the manor and gather reinforcements. To that end, he thrust his hand forward, bracing himself for the awful pain, and used the prioress's talent to force the geists to remain corporeal. A flash of light left him, traveling through the entire catacombs. The whispers quivered as the power forced them out of the walls and into the corridor where, suddenly physical, they collided with one another and clogged the way forward. Their mouths twisted in terrible ways, though they didn't scream or moan, just uttered those whispers. A few of the geists at the front escaped the clog, so Davriel grabbed Tekenda's hand again, leading her down another corridor, lined with grave markers on the walls. The way was lit by candles, which were burning low now that the priory's tenders had fallen. He pulled Takenda into a nook and hissed at her to be quiet. Then he used the ink spell, painting a wall with darkness to look like shadow. Extending farther down the corridor, just to the right, he held his breath, waiting as the Geists drew near. Thankfully they took the bait and flowed away, chasing towards the shadows. He pulled Takenda by her hand and out the nook and headed toward the right, hoping this path would wrap around toward the room with the sealant stone. Awful whispers echoed through the tunnels, seeming to come from all directions. "Willia will know about the secret exits," Takenda whispered. "That must be how she got in and out after they brought her body here. Be careful." "She's posted Geists to stop us from going this way," Davriel whispered, peeking around a corner. "Any thoughts on how to get around them?" "No," Takenda whispered. She stared blankly ahead. Could she really have done these terrible things? She faked her death, didn't she? She pretended to have been taken by the Whispers, maybe so suspicion wouldn't fall upon her. She knew they'd bring her to the Priory instead of returning her to the bog. But how did she fool us? "Intentional dust willow overdose, I'd suspect," Davriel said. "The leaves are a sedative. Eat them in their strength, and it will induce a catatonic state. It happened sometimes to the farmers, he was told." Davriel turned and pulled her toward another tunnel, but she tugged back. "Do you hear that song?" she asked. "No," Davriel said. "I only hear the Geists." He pulled her forcibly after him, around another corner, then pulled to a halt. Green light illuminated Geists flowing toward him from that direction. Right. He dashed back the way they'd come, turning another corner, then pulled to a stop there as well. A tall figure stood at the end of the tunnel, blocking the way to the stairs, lit from the sides by green, whispering spirits. He was tempted to try rushing her. She was just a girl of 15, but he recognized that glinting light reflecting in her eyes. Power. Unimaginable power. Even if he could reach her through the Geists, the entity inside her would protect her from simple physical wounds. "What would you do?" the girl asked. "To know that you'd never again be afraid. To know that you'd never again be hunted. To forever banish the things that scratched at your door at night. To, for once, rule instead of to be ruled." "I know how you feel," Davriel said back, smelling blood and smoke. "There is always a price. Sometimes it's too high to pay. That's simple economics." "It is time," the entity said. "Why do you hesitate?" Willia gestured, and Geists flowed down the corridor, careful this time not to trip one another. Davriel moved to the run to the left, but Takenda pulled on his hand toward a different corridor. "No," she said. "This way, toward the song." "That's a dead end," he said. "We visited that chamber earlier tonight." "It's a mural," she said. "Maybe a way out." She pulled out of his grip and ran that way. As Geists flooded down the corridor, Davriel cursed and reluctantly followed. Rough stone under her fingers, cool, dusty air, the second darkness swallowing her, and a song, a sweet, beautiful, mournful song. Takenda felt the tunnel end at an open room, circular. She remembered this place. It was where they kept the bodies awaiting burial. Trembling, she felt around the room until she reached the empty slab where her sister had once lain. At that moment, Takenda finally accepted what had happened. Her sister was a murderer. Poor Willia, terrified of the second darkness. She'd hid from it until, at long last, it had claimed her as its own, just not in the way either of them had feared. "Can you open the secret tunnel?" Davriel said, his boots scraping stone as he stepped into the chamber. That melody, so haunting. The song was closer now. Takenda felt around the room until she touched a carved portion of the back wall, a relief depicting the Nameless angel. "The man of the manor," Willia's voice echoed against stone. Takenda thought that she was approaching from the tunnel that led to this room. Whispers walked with her, their voices overlapping. "Your reputation proved helpful. Everyone was so eager to believe you were a murderer." "Let's make a deal, child," Davriel said. "I won't insult you with an offer of riches, but I am worth more than simple liqueur. Let me live. I can tell you many things about that voice inside your head." "It said you'd try to deal," Willia whispered, "but it also told me that you hold something I need, something that will make me so strong nobody will ever again be able to challenge me." Takenda felt at the carving, following the contours of the stone. She felt to the angel's hand, which held a carved version of the sealing stone. There, that was the button. "You'd kill your own sister?" Davriel asked. "Truly, are you that heartless?" Willia was silent for a moment. Takenda could hear her breath, which had a ragged edge. She was close, perhaps standing in the tunnel outside the chamber. "Takenda," Willia said, her voice icy cold, "has always had the voice of an angel. And do you know what the angels did to us, man of the manor? The same thing every lord, devil, and demon in this land has done. They bled us, so we bled them back." Takenda pressed the carving in just the right way, as she'd seen Rom do. The wall clicked, then her weight caused it to inch open, stone grinding on stone. She pushed into the hidden chamber, the source of the song. Behind her, Davriel gasped. "What?" she asked. "What do you see?" "It's her." Chapter 19. Unison. It was an angel, with its wings nailed to the wall. A beautiful, yet otherworldly figure of pale, Selenic skin and gossamer hair. Clad in a red and white robe, she slumped on the floor of the otherwise dull chamber, colorful against gray, like a rose on a grave. Her head bowed, her wings were spread behind her like battle banners unfurled, but they'd been pierced by thick iron spikes that had been pounded directly into cracks in the stone wall. Transfixed, Davriel forgot the geists, the pain of his compounding headache, anger, frustration, even a hint of fear. Each bled away before this incredible sight. The Nameless angel. She was real. She was here. She was entrancing. And she was dead. The figure didn't stir as Takenda felt her way into the room, then knelt. She reached out, caressing the angel's doll-like face, then cupped it and lifted it in her hands, feeling at the skin. Since the girl's eyesight was gone, she didn't seem to notice that the angel's throat had been slit. That robe must once have been pure white. The scarlet coloring was blood. What an incredible waste. What an injustice that something so beautiful had been ruined here in this crude prison. This was a place where men died. Something this heavenly should not have been forced to suffer such a mundane fate. Fool man, Davriel thought, angry at himself. Your mortality betrays you. This thing wasn't pure or grand or innately good. It was simply created to evoke those emotions in you. In any case, this was no secret passage out. The hidden stone door that Takenda had opened looked in only the box of a prison. He turned back toward Willia. The young woman stood in the doorway to the small funeral chamber, glowing green spirits gathering around her to light the hallway behind. Candles flickered in their alcoves, casting an inconsistent glow over the bodies of the newly dead who awaited burial. Willia stared past him, toward the angel. She doesn't decompose. Nobody knows why. The blood stays wet all these months. They made Rom do it, you know. They'd locked her away when the madness struck her, and Rom, he came to the priory to escape the blood. But as soon as he got here, they made him kill our god. She looked up, haunted, meeting Davriel's eyes. I came back here after that first time I used the power, after I took my parents. I didn't say what I'd done, but I begged for the priests to promise me that the angel was real. They gave me false assurances, but Rom, I don't think he could bear it. He brought me down here and showed me, and that's when I knew. Nobody can protect me. I have to do it myself. The entity will consume you, Davriel whispered. It will feed your powers until they destroy everything you've ever loved. I don't care, she said. I know you don't right now, but you will. Willia pointed, and the Geists, who had stopped outside near her, flooded into the room toward Davriel. Hellfire, what did he have left? The spell to summon a weapon? Useless. Takenda's warding power, only a sliver of it remained. The ink spell? He could write his last testament on the walls as his spirit was ripped from his body. He had only 2 cards left to play, the entity and the power to leave. Davriel moved backward, soon bumping into Takenda, who had still knelt before the dead angel. She was crying softly, a mournful song leaving her lips. A part of Davriel knew he had to run, leave this place, slip through the blind eternities, escape. Deep down, he knew that this last ability he had was the source of his confidence. If things got too bad, he could always run. You really are just a coward, the entity said inside him, as if surprised. I thought when you fled before it was wisdom. You saw that the ones hunting you were too powerful. But now you could have enough strength to defeat them if you wanted, and still you think of fleeing. Davriel gathered his concentration and, pushing aside both the entity and thoughts of fleeing, slammed his will into Willia's mind. He imagined his strength as a sword, piercing her skull. Willia grunted, stumbling back. Her control slipped. She was untrained, unpracticed, so for just a moment, Davriel touched the power lurking within her. Hellfire. Davriel's mind had expanded like an explosion. In the blink of an eye, he saw 100 different planes. He saw millions of people living and loving and eating and sleeping and breathing and dying and never knowing just how tiny they were. The same thing had happened to him when he'd first touched the entity all those years ago. Most people were so insignificant, but some individuals moved worlds. Some individuals created worlds. He wanted so desperately to be one of those, a person who controlled fate rather than living by it. It was the great contradiction of his life, perhaps every life. He acknowledged that the world worked by incentives. At their core, people were creatures of instinct. Yet, Davriel Kane wanted to believe he was different. His control slipped. He was too tired, and the power inside Willia was too vast. Unless he used his entity, he would never be able to defeat it. Davriel was forced back, and awareness of the room returned. The Geists surrounded him. They clawed at him, their icy hands sinking into his skin, brushing his soul. Davriel groaned, sagging, held up by the multitude of spectral hands. They picked at his spirit like ravens at the intestines of the battlefield dead. Takenda's song grew louder, a dirge for the fallen. Davriel grunted beneath the touch of the whispers, and felt his soul, his very being, slipping from his body. He used the last sliver of Takenda's power to resist them, and it just barely prevented his soul from being taken. But in that moment, he broke down and tried to flee. He tried to send himself into the blind eternities and leave this plane. He failed. The Whisperers had hold of his soul, and their touch anchored him to this place. He tried again and again. For the first time in ages, Davriel Kane felt a true panic. "It is time," the entity said. "You know it is." "No," Davriel thought, smelling blood and smoke. "Why?" the entity demanded. "Why do you resist? Use me." "No." "Why? Why would you choose death?" "I," Davriel screamed, "will not be that man again." He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. "I see," the entity said. "You are not the person I thought you to be. So be it. Die then. I will find another." His strength exhausted, his options expended, Davriel fell slack in the grip of the Geists, and yet their fingers on his soul loosened. He opened his eyes. Around him, the Geists had stopped moving, withdrawing their hands. They were looking to the side. Toward the dead angel? No, toward Takenda. Her humming voice rose in the room. The song had never worked on these creatures. He didn't completely understand why, or what had changed now. It's her song, he thought. The one she's humming. Is it different? Exhausted, he reached inside himself and found one of the only spells he had left, and used it, a simple summoning charm. Takenda. The viol appeared in his hand. "Takenda," he said, "whatever you're doing, keep going." Takenda cradled the face of the dead angel, humming the song, the one she had heard in the distance, leading her here. Around her, the sound of the Whisperers faded. She heard her viol somewhere, suddenly responding to her song, like a call and a reply. Everything around her was the second darkness, and yet she looked upward, and something seemed to shimmer, glowing above her. A figure made of pure white light, with wings that seemed to extend into eternity. "Takenda," Davriel said. She felt him scramble up to her, crawling across the stone floor. "This song, it's different. The whisperers have frozen as they listen to it. Even your sister seems transfixed." "It's a song I don't know," she whispered, breaking it off. "I've forgotten it." "That makes no sense. Just get back to singing." Instead, Takenda reached upward toward the light. The figure reached out its hand, touching her. "The angel's soul," Takenda whispered. "It's still here, trapped like those of the faithful." "That's nonsense," Davriel said. "Angels are creations of magic, like demons. They have no souls." And yet, Takenda touched the light. "Child," a somehow familiar voice said, "why have you stopped singing?" "How can I sing that song," she whispered, "when they're all dead, when I've forgotten the warmth of the sun, when I've lost even my sister to the true darkness? How can I possibly sing now? Because this is when songs are most needed. The song of warding doesn't work. It's what they needed, but it didn't save them." She lowered her head. "There's no light left, and I cannot see." "That is the secret, Takenda. What do you do when the night grows cold and the darkness comes for you?" She looked up. "What song would you sing," the voice asked, "if you were to choose?" "Does it matter?" "It always mattered. Listen to the music, child. Hear it and sing." Takenda started to hum. Again, her viola responded, encouraging. Something stirred inside of her, and she rose, resting her fingers on Davriel's shoulder. She took the viol carefully from his hands, then stepped back into the funeral chamber. She walked as if into a cold wind. Among the spirits of the dead, these whisperers had once been her people. They were not monsters. They were her friends, her family, people she loved. They had simply forgotten that. It was time to remind them. Takenda opened her mouth and sang. Not the warding song. That had always been the song of the first darkness, sung while the people slept. A song of haunted places and barred doors. As she felt their fingers upon her skin, she sang a different song. The song of her youth. The song she'd sung to them while they worked. The song of lives lived. A joyful song. An emotion that kindled as she let it out. Cold fingers on her skin seemed to warm as she remembered days in the sun, a light she could not see but could feel nonetheless. Days singing joyful tunes to the workers, the women of the village, the children who danced around her. It was so hard to find warmth in the darkness, but when the night grew cold and the darkness came for you, that was when you needed to light a fire and make your own light. Davriel pulled back against the wall. He'd been too tired to rise, too tired to do anything but crawl toward the girl. Takenda's song washed through the room, an incongruously, almost impossibly joyful sound. It was not a song one expected in a crypt or on a night spent fleeing ghosts. The Geists stood mesmerized before this strange, almost forgotten emotion. Their master, Takenda's sister, turned her head and closed her eyes, as if confronted by a sudden unbearable light, though Davriel saw no such thing. The faces of the Geists began to melt, or... no, they began to unmelt. Quiverings ceased, distortions reversed, hollow eyes blinked with awareness, and mouths shrank from gaping maws into cautious smiles. All around him, terrors of the night became washwomen, farmers, smiths, and children. Never in his life had he been so happy to see a group of peasants. That song filled the chamber. It made stones rattle like percussions. It thrummed through Davriel, a jubilant, elated melody. He found himself standing up, his fatigue lost before that amazing, exultant sound. Willia, however, growled. She seemed to visibly shake as she howled in anger, scrambling forward, losing all semblance of control. She reached toward her sister, as if to grab Takenda and strangle her, or pull the power by force from her. "No, you don't," Davriel thought, pointing at her and summoning the last remnants of a fading spell inside his mind. The ink spell. With it, he painted Willia's eyes black. She screamed immediately, stumbling and falling to the ground. "The darkness! No, I banished you!" She trembled, holding out her hands, unable to see them. The second darkness. Hellfire. Takenda's song overwhelmed Willia's mournful cries. The tune was so blasted optimistic, it made him want to dance. Him. Davriel resisted the urge as the song infused the catacombs. Crypts vibrated with the enthusiastic, eager tune, and even the bones seemed to rattle with excitement. The Geists began to walk toward Takenda, pulsing with a green light that was somehow more alive than the sickly glow they'd expressed earlier. One by one, they merged into Takenda, their light adding to one that grew around her. Dozens upon dozens of them walked into the room, moving with increased speed, joining that pulsing light, until at last Takenda stood alone above the cowering form of her sister. "I don't understand," Willia said, clawing at her face, trying to make herself see. "What happened to the Geists?" "They remembered who they were," Takenda said. "That song..." Willia looked up. "I remember that song, Takenda. I just want to escape the darkness." "I know. But you shouldn't have done so by banishing it to everyone around you." Takenda reached out and touched her sister. "I'm sorry, but for you, Willia, there must be a third darkness." Takenda pushed her sister lightly, and Willia's body fell backward. Then a puff of light emerged from her, a soul, sickly and green. It distorted, then quietly vanished, fading away. As soon as Willia died, a second, far more powerful, green light burst from her corpse and streamed into Takenda. Takenda tipped her head back, eyes opening wide as the light encompassed her. "This is your final chance," the entity said inside Davriel. She will be overcome by the power for a short time, and your talent gives you an ideal opportunity. Reach out and take her power, Davriel. You could still have us both." The entity was right. By instinct, Davriel reached out, and he found that the completed power of the bog was settling within Takenda. It didn't rebuff him as it had before. For the moment, it was as confused as she was. He could take it. In that moment, he saw himself as the bearer of both entities. He'd become a being with unrivaled strength. He saw kingdoms bending to his will. He saw himself with power over fate, over destiny, over millions of lives. Such power, such incredible power, and such misery. Broken bodies as far as the eye could see. He saw himself as that terrible man sitting upon a harsh throne. He saw himself forced to destroy rival after rival. No time to rest. No time for fiddling with word puzzles. No quiet nights spent reading while Miss Highwater tried to figure out how to cook human food. Davriel Kane was no hero, but he knew what he wanted from life. He discovered that truth after terrible personal experience. He would not become that man again, and so he withdrew his hand and left the power alone. Takenda's sight returned. She gasped as light blossomed inside her. A wonderful, pure, verdant light. A light that seemed so powerful as to shine through stones as if they were paper. "You have been chosen," a voice said in her mind, "and you have done well." Takenda fell to her knees before the power, which somehow she already knew intimately. This power that had created her and given her purpose. The power they'd called the bog. The secret of the approaches. Her destiny. "You," she whispered. "You were in all of us. Everyone in the approaches, but strongest in my sister and me. An accident splitting between us? No. I often seek the strongest host," the entity said. "Though once the Priory began to siphon away my power, I had to accelerate the process." The light grew, consuming all that she saw. Her soul vibrated with the pure beauty of its song, and within the entity she saw the souls of thousands who had been nurtured here in the approaches. The entity, seeding its power among them, letting it grow within their souls, then reclaiming it again, enhanced and aged when the people died. "My sister," she said. "Can we restore her? Can we make things go back to the way they were before?" "No. Your sister's choices changed her, and those around her forever. That is life and growth." "I don't like it," Takenda said. "I rediscovered the Song of Joy. Shouldn't that make things better?" "Different, yes. But better is a matter of human perception. Regardless, I will not force you to bear me. If you wish to release me to another, you may do so. Or, in turn, you can keep me, and use my strength as your power." What will that do to me?" she asked. "Will I become evil like Willia became?" "That depends on your choices, but you cannot go back to being what you were. Either way, you can return to your village without me and be forever changed, or you can take me and be forever changed. for only the dead ever stop changing. Takenda wavered, then settled on a decision. I will bear this power. Perspective slammed into her like the weight of a mountain. She saw worlds, hundreds upon hundreds of them, so many people. Power permeated her. She knew instantly the generations who had lived in the approaches, memories of the ages, the essence of all those who had come before. She gasped beneath the weight of it, becoming one person with 10,000 souls. And then she let some go. The entity didn't like it, but she was its master. She could not keep the souls of those who could still live. She gave back Jargo and his family, Dekna, the schoolteacher, Miller Hedveka, Rom and the priests, every person whose body still lived, waiting for the spirit to return. That didn't include her parents, who had no bodies to which they could return. Those souls snuggled in against her own, warm and soft, but not her sister's soul. Takenda had recovered the power she held, but poor Willia, she was just gone. Takenda's glow expanded. She was the power, the souls, the entity of the bog, Takenda of Varlazen, and a thousand others all at once. Takenda turned, looking at the poor corpse in the prison, its wings nailed to the wall. I saw the angel's soul. I touched it. I know nothing of this, the entity said. I do not think it possible. Yet it was true. She was the child of two worlds, two gods, two ideals, and she considered it. Something deep within her exploded, awakening at the power. Wait. She stepped up to Davriel, who was actually looking haggard. She reached and touched the side of his face. Thank you, she said, her voice overlapping to her own ears, as if 1,000 people had said it. Then she stabbed her power into his head, and withdrew the small piece of her strength he had taken from her earlier in the night. But never try to reach inside my mind again. Then, complete for the first time in her life, Takenda vanished. Epilogue. To Davriel, headaches were a familiar kind of pain. The kind of pain a family member could inflict. The kind of pain that you had known for so long you sometimes welcomed it because you recognized it so well. The kind of pain you almost mistook for something else entirely. He settled down in the prioress's chair behind her desk, sighing and holding his cup of tea. He worked a little further on the contract before him, written in demonic script, but that headache did make it difficult. Why can't you fix headaches again? He asked the entity. It didn't respond. Still sulking, he asked, because I didn't take the power? Contemplating, it said softly. I had always assumed that someday you would awaken. I've been forced to see that might not be the case. You are not worthy of me, and never were. Don't be like that, Davriel replied. Think how jealous you'd have been with another entity dividing my attention. You have failed greatly, Davriel Kane, it said. You will know the cost of this day. You will curse yourself when that which you love burns, not because you had too much power, but because you lacked the strength to stop your enemies." Davriel shivered. There was something about the way the entity spoke, a hostility he had never known from it before. "They will come for you," the entity warned. "Those who search for you will hear what has happened here. You have just ensured you will never, ever be able to hide again." It fell silent. Davriel sighed softly, then took a sip of his tea. For the moment, that deliciously floral taste in his mouth, he didn't really care about the entity. He gladly felt the tea soothing him. It had always helped with the headaches. On the floor in front of the desk, a body stirred. The prioress blinked open her eyes. Elsewhere in the priory, Davriel heard calls as the other priests started to wake up. The girl had restored their souls before leaving. He'd ascertained that when he'd found the prioress breathing, but it seemed that it took a little while for their bodies to recover. The prioress sat up, putting her hand to her head. She looked up and frowned, noticing Davriel at her desk. "You lied to me, Merlinda," Davriel said softly. "You have kept terrible secrets from me. He held up the tea. "I found an entire tin of our Arlesian dust willow in your cupboard," he said. "I expect you to explain yourself post-haste." She frowned. "Also," Davriel noted, "there's a small matter of a deific angel kept locked in your catacombs. An angel who was slowly siphoning power away from the bog, building a crescendo of untapped strength that begged for some foolish mortal to abuse it. But really, let's keep our attention on the serious problems. You explicitly told me you were out of tea." She pulled herself to her feet and glanced out the window at the rising sun. "What happened?" Davriel said, sipping the tea. "Oh. Willia Varleyson killed her parents by accident after reclaiming the power locked in the catacombs. She returned here, intending to confess, then lost her faith when she found out you murdered her god. She instead began gathering the power of the bog, and, enthralled by its promises, started to pull the souls out of the people of Varleyson." "Hellfire," the prioress muttered. "Young Willia, are you sure?" "Well, the first few times she tried to kill me last night I was a little uncertain, but when she actively commanded an army of geists to rip my soul from my body, the truth finally dawned on me." He sipped his tea. "I stopped her, by the way. You're welcome." "It was your duty," she said, "as Lord of the Approaches." "I really should have read the entire contract," Davriel said. "Where was the part about cleaning up your messes? Right after the articles of Caveat Emptor, I assume?" She didn't reply, instead standing in the sunlight and closing her eyes, then letting out a long sigh. Davriel rested his fingers on a sword he'd placed on the desk, long, curved, and wicked. Poor Crunchnar. Was it strange that Davriel was going to miss the sour fool? He'd never find another demon who was that fun to tease. "We will need to prepare," Davriel said, sipping his tea. "After the events of last night and this morning, we may see an increase in inquiries after me, ones we will not find easy to turn aside." She glanced at him. "I am still rather put out to find a dead god in your basement, Melinda." "She wasn't our god," the prioress said, "many more than the bog was. She was our burden. Both were." "Well, now they're someone else's burden," Davriel said. "Poor girl." "What do you mean?" the prioress asked, turning. Then she paled, looking at what he'd been writing. "Have you been profaning my priory with demonic magic, Cain? How dare you?" He looked up, pointing his pen at her. "Don't even start. Just don't. Besides, this is barely magic. It's more a legal document encouraging the dark forces, reminding them that there is one being most likely to win my soul above all others. Hopefully, almost, he would pray to that dead angel if he thought it would help. Please." His heart leapt as he heard a group of startled screams echoing from below. He jumped to his feet, tucking a bundle under his arms and pushing out into the hallway. The prioress followed as he dashed down the steps, following the shouts and entering the catacombs. He quickly walked to the small chamber where the sealing stone had once been kept. Several young priests were in the room, screaming in fear. Likely they'd been trying to find a way to put the trinket back together. If so, they had been interrupted by a dark figure forming from smoke in front of them. Davriel quickly took off his cloak and settled it on the dark form as it took shape. It wasn't entirely covering, however, and so the prioress gasped as Miss Highwater appeared. One of the priests actually fainted. "Don't gawk," Davriel said to the others. "It only encourages her." The demon caught his eye, then smiled. Relief flooded through him. It was her smile. He'd been half afraid a new creature would be created to fulfill the instructions he'd written. "Did we win?" she asked him. "Honestly, I'm not sure," Davriel replied. "My peasants are back, but our little musician girl absconded with an ancient and incalculably valuable power." Miss Highwater, true to form, held out her hand expectantly. He smiled, then unwrapped her ledger from the bundle of clothing he was holding and handed it to her. She eyed the priests, who were trying to inch out of the room. The prioress, showing good sense, had folded her arms, but didn't appear like she was going to make any demands of him. "Only one fainted," Miss Highwater muttered. "I really am losing my touch, aren't I? And you let the girl get away with the power of the bog? Really?" "I was busy mourning Crunchnar's untimely demise." "You sap," she said, flipping through her ledger and the notes at the back. "Joke all you want, but I know you're going to miss him. Anything else I should know?" The priests were hiding an angel. They locked her up when she went mad, then made poor Rom slit her throat. "Cute," she said, "and I'm supposed to be the demon." "They might be in the market for a new object of worship," Davriel said. "You could apply." "What do you suppose their policy is on nudity?" "I'd guess somewhere between hell no and oh, angels above, my brain is melting. But remember, they do have nice hats." She chuckled. "I'll pass. I believe I still have an unfulfilled contract with a certain willful diabolist. As for Tekenda, I suppose I'll need to track her down. Really, Dav, how did you let her filch that power from you?" "Perhaps I didn't want it." Miss Highwater snapped her ledger closed, narrowing her eyes at him. "Tekenda really did deserve the entity," he said. "She did most of the work, singing and reclaiming the souls of the villagers. You should have seen her. It was very heroic." "You don't believe in heroism." "Nonsense," he said. I absolutely accept that it is an attribute others believe they possess. As for Miss Varlazen, well, the truth is that I needed to prove a point. By doing nothing? Nothing is the very thing to which I am best suited." He held out his arm to her, and she took it. "Come, do you think we can expect the peasants to get back to the harvest today? They've spent an entire day dead, so they should be well rested. And I appear to be down a single tin of tea. And that's it for the story. Whew, that was an interesting one. For all those who follow me along or watching this later on, thank you for coming with me. This was Children of the Nameless, perhaps one of my favorite Magic the Gathering stories. I'm very glad to have finished it. Look forward to whatever it is I am doing next week. Not sure what it is going to be, most likely a new story, but we'll find out when we get there. Thanks again, and have a great day.